What if War Plan Red happened?
Today, Canada and the US are the best of allies. Thus, it's hard to imagine a time when there was enough suspicion between the two nations that the US had a plan to invade Canada that was not completely out of the question. This was War Plan Red. In the late 20s, the US created color plans for different nations that there was a possibility of war with. Plan Orange was war with Japan, green was with Mexico, white was a Marxist rebellion, black was a war with Germany, etc. War Plan Red, meanwhile, was a plan for a war with the British Empire. The main reason that a war between the British Empire and America happened was that Britain declined at the same time America rose to power. Britain and America never had a clashing of real interests after the mid-19th century, and thus there was never a real reason for war. There was always something else to worry about and to unite over rather than kill each other, being it the Kaiser, the Nazis, or the Soviet Union.
Thus, for War Plan Red to have any possibility of happening, we would have to tinker with events before its staging in the 30s to create a possible backdrop for it.
In our timeline, the British Empire was not a threat for the Americans in the 20s and 30s because World War I had bled Britain dry. Too many young men had died in the trenches of Somme and Ypres for any possibility of future war to have been realistic. And so, in this timeline for World Plan Red to have happened, we would need to have the British run their war effort far more savvily, not doing amazingly bloody offenses such as the Somme that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, and trying to have as few casualties as possible that would not create a disillusionment with the empire amongst the British people.
The British would have to feel that the Americans were the greatest threat to the Empire, and that only by war with America could the British Empire survive, since America would be one of the few powers still around after the end of World War I. But why this logic wouldn't apply to the Soviets and later the Japanese, I can't tell you.
For War Plan Red to have happened, both America and Britain would have had to have been run by psychotic war hawks. This is because they would be far too reasonable with our timeline's leadership to have War Plan Red happening. If there was a minor border dispute, it would have been solved by diplomacy in our timeline, but in this timeline it would have to be solved by war. Perhaps in America, Teddy Roosevelt's leadership would have led to war mania, or perhaps in Britain with the victory in World War I, there would be the feeling that war and intervention was the best policy.
Even with all of these, War Plan Red would likely still be unlikely, and the war would likely start with a mistake, similarly to World War I, because of this, since neither side would have any reason or proper grudge for a declaration of war. And after this mistake, it would have to escalate to a point where both sides would think they would lose national character and power if they lost. For the sake of this timeline, I have to choose a date to start the war, since it would have to be a good stretch after World War I so that both sides would forget their casualties taken during the war and that they were allies, but it also have to be a fair amount of time before World War II, so this stays true to the timing of the actual plan. I choose 1935.
The first action of the war would be a US invasion of Canada, and this is an accurate map except for one detail. It says that the US would blockade Halifax, while in reality the US was planning a naval assault on Halifax, in which if the city was not seized quickly, it might use poison gas. Meanwhile, the Canadians had their own plan called Defense Scheme 1, which they would invade the northern United States and try to seize cities near the Canadian border, and thus have the Americans concentrate their fire on those cities instead of Canada, thus giving time for the British to send troops to protect Canada. And honestly, it wouldn't really matter if this plan did well, because the Canadians might easily be able to seize Seattle or Fargo, but the sheer power of the US could simply drive them out very quickly and conquer Canada. The British plan, meanwhile, was to only send an army to protect Canada if it existed long enough to ask for one. The British felt trying to protect Canada was useless, since the US likely conquered it before the British would be able to create an army to protect it. As you've probably surmised by now, the US would likely conquer Canada very quickly if War Plan Red actually happened, due to its population and industrial advantage. At this point, fighting would likely take place in the American and British possessions in the Caribbean, which would be an American victory because the Americans would have a closer home front and they would have more industrial power, as well as the British possessions in the Pacific, which would go either way, and the American dominion of the Philippines, which would be conquered by the British. At this point, both the American and the British war plans said they would stop general fighting, and would instead attack enemy trade in their own hemispherical waters. And even with the more aggressive governments, there's nothing really else they can do. The British, I guess, could try to shell coastal American cities before the US Navy got powerful enough to not allow it, but a US invasion of Britain and Australia due to the sheer distance would be suicidal, and a British amphibious invasion of North America would be suicidal because of the sheer size, industrial power, and distance of North America. The war would actually end with the Americans taking Britain's possession in the New World and Canada, and with the British taking America's possession of the Philippines. When World War II would break out, the British would not want another war so soon after their previous war. When Hitler would invade Poland, the British, and thus the French, would simply let it happen to prevent another war. Actually, this is not very unrealistic. Hitler had no interest in a war with the West and felt that the true threat to the Aryan race was the Judeo-Marxism of the Soviet Union and the Slavic peoples. Hitler's main objective was the conquest of the Soviet Union from the beginning, and didn't really care about the Western Front. Hitler would confront Stalin without a war with Britain and France. Without the distraction of the Western Front, and without the West sending Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, the Germans would do better than our timeline. Yet the sheer size of Russia and its industrial and manpower would prevent a complete German takeover. The most likely outcome is that both sides fight each other to a standstill in the 50s. A border would likely be drawn somewhere in the Ukraine and Belarusia. In China and many other countries that were communist in our timeline, these countries would not be communist because the Russians would be busy spending their 10 years fighting the Germans, and thus wouldn't have had the resources to help the local communist regimes that became communist in our timeline. For example, China would have remained nationalist in this timeline. Meanwhile, in the East, Japan would still fight the colonial powers of Britain, France, and the Dutch. And the Japanese would be victorious, because they'd be a lot closer to their home front, and their supply lines would be longer, and they were more adept to that region's warfare. In this timeline, due to the French and British not being occupied in Europe, the Japanese would not press any further than they did in our timeline, and Japanese hegemony would be established in the Pacific, but likely not in Australia or India. The war in China would likely end in a truce, since the Chinese would be unable to drive the Japanese out of China fully without aid, but due to the sheer size and population of China, it would be impossible for the Japanese to fully conquer it. Since the British would control the Philippines, the Japanese would not feel threatened by a possible American counterattack to a Pacific campaign. Thus, the Japanese would not feel the need to war with the Americans, and thus the Battle of Pearl Harbor would never have happened. The war with Japan would not be as taxing for the colonial powers as the war with Germany. Thus, Britain and France would not come out of World War II bled to the bone. This would mean that they would be able to maintain their old colonial empires after the war. Decolonization would not have happened in this timeline. In this timeline, Europe would still be the most powerful region on Earth, while America and Russia would not be the global hegemons they were in our timeline. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. Whatifalthist. Thank you for watching.